Hi, welcome to lecture 8, workshop 8. This is your last for this class, SOWK913. Of course, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. This is land that was never ceded, and it's important to always recognise the custodians of the lands we walk on today. So currently I am on Dharawal country of the Wadi people. So we're going to be talking about trends in social policy. And again, this is a high-level overview. The details of this are in your readings. So when we're thinking about insights into social policy and preparing social workers for the future, what we're going to be covering today is social diversity and multiculturalism, social policy and citizenship. Also going to be looking at social media and the role that plays and how big data drives social policy today. So some definitely very meaty topics that will be covered. So we're just going to do a recap on workshop 2 and the readings relating to that, because it's really important to understand how they actually interrelate with what we're talking about today. So again, when we're thinking about each of these topics, we want you to keep in mind the policy actors and organisations and thinking about the interpretive policy analysis with particular attention to discourse, power, networks and collaboration. So again, the policy actors, you covered this in assessment 2. We also did this in workshop 2. So thinking about the range of policy actors, which include politicians, advisors, public servants, government agencies and line departments, academics, such as myself, think tanks and interest groups. Of course, when we're thinking about discourse, power, networks and collaboration, they're all interlinked. So discourse relating to what's said and how it's said, power about who holds the power, so whose voices are dominant within these conversations, why they're dominant, who holds the space, and the networks and collaboration, so who's working together and collaborating together for what intended outcome. So if we're talking about welfare policy, we need to be thinking about what is the purpose behind people's agenda. And you can have a look at that through the discourse, and also thinking about what power dynamics are at play here. People who are on, say, the New Start allowance, which is the allowance for people who don't have a job, they have very little power by comparison, say, to government agencies or other big players in the space. So talking about citizenship, so this will be really interesting to hear your thoughts during the workshop, given that we do have a large number of students who are international students as well as Australian students who might have become an Australian citizen. So what does that mean to become an Australian citizen? What does it mean for the person? What does it mean for the country? When we're thinking about citizenship, thinking about what privileges and rights and responsibilities does that bring? And is being a citizen inclusive or exclusive? So there's dialogue, for example, that we should be citizens of the world, not citizens of the country. Because obviously when you're a citizen of this country versus, say, a resident, you can vote. And if you're on other types of visas, say a student visa, for example, you have a lot less rights than you do if you are a citizen. So, for example, you can't access our welfare scheme. And it depends on what country you're from. You may be able to access free emergency healthcare at a hospital, where in some countries you can't. If you're from a certain country, you can't. So is it inclusive or exclusive to able to support people to be a citizen? We also know that some people who've wanted to become residents, for example, have applied for residency, and this has been in the media, and haven't been allowed to become residents or citizens because, say, one of their children actually has Down syndrome or another health condition, which means that Australia would be essentially footing the bill for their ongoing health treatment. So is excluding someone because they have a health issue inclusive or exclusive? So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And when we're talking about responsibilities and privileges of Australian citizenships, as an Australian citizen, you have a number of responsibilities as outlined under the Department of Home Affairs, which is obey the law of Australia, vote in federal and state elections and in a referendum. So for those that aren't aware, we have a compulsory voting system. Defend Australia should the need arise, and serve on a duty if called to do so. And then the privileges. So the responsibilities come with certain privileges, So it's a privilege to vote, which I have to agree, it is a privilege to vote. You can apply for children born overseas to become an Australian citizen, pregnant at the moment, flying to Rome. If I had my child in Italy, I would still be able to apply for my child to be an Australian citizen. Again, when we're talking about being able to defend our country, we can apply for Australian Public Service as well as the Australian Defence Force. We can also seek to be elected in Parliament. But just being mindful, you can only seek to be elected in Parliament if you hold a single citizenship. So if you're a dual citizen, you can't at this point, and there was a history to that. You can apply for an Australian passport and re-enter Australia freely and ask for consular assistance from an Australian official while overseas. So if, for example, you are in trouble overseas, if a war breaks out or there's a pandemic, you can seek the Australian support from the Australian official, so an embassy or a consulate while you're overseas. So thinking about what you're trading in terms of your rights and responsibilities to the privileges that you get. So again, thinking about Australia and its democratic beliefs. So when we think about Australia, this is the way it's framed from a government point of view. Australia is a democracy, which is why you have the right, but also the privilege of voting. The rule of law. So we have a rule of law which, in principle, seeks to ensure that everybody is treated equally, including people of positions of power. So our politicians are technically held to the same standard as well as anyone who might have a lot of money. And also that we have the capacity to live peacefully in this country. That is, we reject violence, and we also are under the rule of law, and everybody, again, is treated the same. And then we also talk about, from an Australian point of view, that we respect all individuals regardless of background. So whether or not you're from the LGBTQIA community, whether you're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, whether you come from another country, so whether it's based on race, disability, etc. So this is what we state our democratic beliefs are about. Now, of course, how they're applied and whether they're applied in practice is very, very different. So there is a difference between discriminating against someone, which can lead to legal ramifications, versus having a discriminatory attitude towards people more generally with against people with disability. So again, these are the principles we try to uphold, but of course they don't always work out in practice. So when we're thinking at social diversity and cultural inclusion, we're really thinking more broadly about people we're looking at the social, political and historical factors and human, so this is a human rights lens that we're looking at to people such as people who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, migrants, to ensure that they can and we can actively participate equally in Australian society. Now, again, this is an aspiration, in my opinion. It's not something that happens in practice, but it is something that we certainly aspire to. So, for example, the Human Rights Commission is responsible for ensuring that Australia upholds these standards at an international level. So thinking about the Human Rights Commission, we've got policies that support women. We have policies that talk about equity inclusion for people with a disability who happen to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And so Australia seeks to be an inclusive country. So what does diversity and the growing, what does diversity and recognition of welfare state how are they related? So again, we're talking about post-industrial, we're talking about neoliberalism here, which seems to be the cornerstone of this of this subject, given that we do function under a neoliberal approach. And the neoliberalism has reshaped the current market and put pressure on welfare regimes. So there's a growing international acknowledgement of the rights of migrants and Indigenous peoples alongside identity politics. So for those that don't know, identity politics is often used by people to talk about talk about people such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been much more politically active and advocating for ourselves. And they see that we are seeking additional benefits based on identity. And that is an identity that they seem to assume is assumed. So if you read someone like Andrew Bolt, who writes for the Daily Telegraph, but is also a feature on Sky News, he regularly talks about identity politics. And it highlights that there is debate around diversity and inclusion and what that looks like. So again, identity politics is a phrase that's not used traditionally by those who are accused of playing identity politics. So one of the premises of this is that people actually want Australia to be multicultural, but only if it means that people are going to be the same. And when people like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people actually call for difference, ways of doing things to meet the needs of our cultures across the country, we can be accused of identity politics. So when thinking about identity politics and multiculturalism, there's evidence that shows social democrats and corporatist welfare regimes are better at accommodating migrants than liberal regimes like Australia and Britain. So if you want to understand those terms, we talked about those in the first couple of weeks. So again, incorporation regimes can be classified, I'll read this quote for you. For example, Australia and Canada are often pointed to as countries with strong multicultural policies, inclusive, but at the same time, both countries employ an elaborate point system that excludes many migrants, especially the poor and uneducated. So again, what this is suggesting is that we might claim to be a multicultural country, but it's a selective multicultural country. And incorporation regimes consist of rules and norms that govern migrants' possibilities to become a citizen, to acquire permanent resident, and to participate in economic, cultural, and political life. So even though we talk about being inclusive, the restrictive nature of our citizenship or permanent residence actually means that we are not as inclusive as what we like to say we are. That's a really chunky topic. That's just an overview. I hope you've done the readings this week, or this fortnight, so that you can get a better understanding of those concepts. Media and social policy. So this is something that I'm very passionate about. So media has an ability to set the agenda, especially in the identification of issues which are likely to attract attention of policy actors. For example, the Northern Territory intervention. So the Northern Territory intervention was a legislative policy that came into effect as early as 2004 from memory. And what this sought to do was save children, essentially. So the Northern Territory intervention came into effect because of the sacred Little Children a Sacred report. And in there, it outlined a number of issues that were related to children in the Northern Territory, which largely were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So the media picked that up and focused on these very small elements of this particular policy. And in response, John Howard, a former Liberal Prime Minister, and sought to pass legislation, the Northern Territory intervention legislation, which meant that the Commonwealth was taking over elements of the Northern Territory policy. So what we ended up seeing was children had to have mandatory health checks, the permit system, which protected Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, which meant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who could actually access their land, was suspended. And so we actually saw that there was this huge media beat up, which has turned out to be not true. So there was, on one of the TV exposés, there was a policy advisor who actually gave a false interview talking about pedophile rings in the Northern Territory, and that was deemed to actually be completely false. So we can see that the media shapes policy quite substantially. That's just one example. So part of this is because we have a 24-hour news cycle, which is probably not even 24 hours anymore, really, when you think about social media, but we still talk about the 24-hour news cycle. And so we're also finding that governments are being really selective about when and how they release news. So, for example, if you want to if you don't want much media attention on a particular topic, you would release it on 24th of December, Christmas Eve, and then there is not likely to be as much media attention in the 24-hour news cycle because there's more people to be on leave. And so you'll find that, but also likewise, when they want to make a big announcement, they will pick an opportune time, which will really hit the front news, if it's a front page, or do a major interview on a radio program or television, because they really want to make sure this news. So people use the media in strategic ways to promote social policy, or anything, to be quite frank with you. So members of parliament employ media advisors. They use these media advisors to talk about how to shape a story, how to control a story. It's actually a really key part of any politician or any government department. They're really careful. So good media advisors never lie. What they do is maybe omit certain things, or they shape the story in a way to make it more palatable. Again, media advisors often come in and out of government. They may also work in interest groups as well. So NGOs also have media advisors. And this is where we get the term spin doctor. So media advisors are also known as spin doctors. And again, they're looking at how to spin a story to benefit a particular politician or political party, or do the least amount of damage. So how do you actually reach a politician then? So thinking about what politicians and their media advisors do, what can you do as a social worker if you've got a particular topic you're passionate about? You create a crisis, i.e. you identify a crisis and you promote that crisis. Politicians also commission a new report to get topics about it, so we can actually create a new report as well. And you develop a new solution. People always like new. And thinking about new indicators and new data. And then there's opportunistic responses. So thinking about all of these things in different ways, you can actually generate attention from a politician. Really important to think about media. And I know media isn't everybody's cup of tea. I personally love it. I have worked in a media team before. I write prolifically. It's an exceptionally good way of communicating your positions and views, or your organisation's positions and views. So using media to help shape the agenda is an excellent way. You're not just communicating with politicians, but you're communicating with people who also might be people you can network and collaborate with, but you're also communicating with other voters. So other voters who help put politicians in power. So thinking about reaching like-minded people to be able to promote and take up the cause that you're identified is really important. So big data. Big data is also something that is new. So when we think about big data, what we're thinking about is ginormous data sets that are fast, complex. They're organisational data, or it could be data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics or Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. They come from the internet, they come from businesses. If you have patient information management systems in a hospital, or you have patient information management systems in a primary healthcare service, that can become part of big data. So data can be numeric from traditional databases, or, as I said, unstructured, like emails, audios, etc., financial transactions, some of which government hold and can be applied for under Freedom of Information Act. So again, this goes down to a lot of this is held by the internet. So e-government or e-government policy control and informatics controls the nature of this data. So policy informatics is an emerging research space to navigate through the challenging complex of layers of uncertainty within government process. So when we're thinking about information in the era of policymaking, it's driven by open data. So that is data that is open and accessible to stakeholders, whether that be a researcher, a think tank, whether that be a community group, other NGOs, thinking about how you can process that data and mining that data. So again, when we think about big data as well, it could also be your analytics from Facebook, which is mined by commercial organizations to then target you with specific ads. So what this does is create a large data set for policy actors to interact with each other, to share information and services, and for researchers to be able to start talking about what is happening in the world using this big data. From a policy point of view, that is invaluable. So again, the more data we have, because we talk about evidence-based policy, you should expect better policies. I will actually state, though, that data is not objective. People always assume particularly numerical data is objective. There is always a subjective element to it. So there is some uncertainty around how, if people have nefarious objectives and they're using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island data to support that objective, they can spin it, much like a spin doctor can for media. So we always have to be mindful that there are some downsides, but particularly for particular groups, which can be made vulnerable through the use of this data. So again, when we're talking about this, it allows policymakers to understand the essence of policy. It's a very good way of assessing policy and to identify opportunities for change, and to also identify and monitor key performance indicators. So policy managers who are savvy within the informatics space, what they're looking to do is, and the skills that are required are systems thinking. So you're not looking at a narrow focus, you're taking a big overview. You're looking at process orientation to public policy. Again, research methods. How am I going to extract this data and use this data? Again, performance manage. How can I actually use this data to, again, set the KPIs and manage and perform and manage and assess against people or organizations against those KPIs? They're management, but they're also really good at helping people understand what's happening in the world by collaborating, and also capacity building. So they need to be able to have collaborative and cooperative capacity building skills and basic communication skills. And again, social media, information technology, and e-government awareness. So policy informatics analysts, they require the following set of skills: advanced research methods, knowledge to inform technology. So they've got to understand what they're looking at and how to analyze that data. Then they've also got to be able to have good skills at data visualization and design, and basic to advanced program language skills. So being able to write programs that extract and to help you then analyze this data is really important. And basic to advanced modeling skills. Modeling has been a tool which is used consistently with COVID, for example, mining the data that's currently available around a whole range of variables that can spit out. It's not quite that easy, but spit out someone's a community or a subgroup of a community's likelihood of getting COVID, and also potentially dying of COVID. So that's really the end of this. And so I hope you've enjoyed policy. I know it is not everyone's cup of tea, but it's really important to think about your role generally as a social worker and how it's impacted by policy. And you are significantly impacted by policy. And if you're impacted then by it, how can you, in turn, through your organisation or even as an individual, impact policy to better meet the needs of your clients? So thank you very much for joining me, and I really look forward to reading the remainder of your assessments.